Thank you. Um, Thanks, Swapno, for everything, and thanks, Carly. Thanks, Craig, for setting up my machine, and thank you, Sarah, and all of you for organizing this event. I was introduced to Write the Docs a few months back, and it's nice to know that you have a forum where you can exchange information and you get to meet people, and it's a fairly informal group, which is what I didn't expect. So that's quite nice about Write the Docs. And so this evening, I'll actually be sharing with you my experiences of transitioning into API tech writing. Now, having trouble changing the slides. All right. Now, a person who's thinking of becoming an API tech writer might reflect on a couple of questions. By API, that stands for Application Programming Interface. And in all honesty, I had all the very same questions, and if not more, before I got into my current role. And I'm certainly not an expert, and I've been in the field for just about a year now. And having been a tech writer for other fields for about 9 years, I thought it'd be interesting to share some of what I think are interesting experiences and really amazing experiences that I feel blessed to have gone through as I transitioned into the role of API tech writer. And also share this with anyone else who might be interested in navigating the developer landscape. Yeah, so these were some of the questions that came to mind when I first came in. Do I know enough to be an API tech writer? Do I need to learn code? And can something that's perhaps technical actually be fun? So those are the kind of questions I'm trying to see if I can answer. Now, to understand my experience of transitioning into my role, I believe it would be useful to mention my background. My previous positions as a tech writer for about 9 years were mainly for the security, education, and also for the medical industry. And currently I work at Google, but more specifically on Google Maps with the JavaScript API. And I'm sure a majority of the audience perhaps knows what an API is. And especially if there are developers out there, you probably know at least one API like the back of your hand. But I'm not going to assume that everyone does, because a year back, I would have heard about APIs, but I wouldn't have been able to explain to anyone what an API is. So the next slide or two kind of tries to explain what an API is and its basic concepts. And if you already know what it is, then I'm explaining the obvious to you. I'm sorry about that, but I thought if it enlightens at least one soul, it would be worthwhile. You probably see APIs applied all around you because we live in a very connected world. Essentially, APIs enable connectivity, allowing you to order the things you want right using your mobile phones, or when you update your social networks, your blogs, you put in a YouTube video there. When you use Facebook and Instagram, you're essentially, or if you're booking flights with just a few clicks, all that's been possible because you use APIs. And essentially what it's doing, it's enabling connectivity that transfers data from one point to the other. But the hero here that no one talks about, that's there in the background, that actually makes this connectivity possible are APIs. It's what makes the interactivity possible, and APIs are actually just a messenger that takes a request and tells the system what to do, and then it brings a response back. A very common analogy that's used to describe an API is that of a waiter in a restaurant that waits to hear your order request and passes on that request to the kitchen and then brings back your order to you. The order that you've requested is brought back to you. And I really like the way a company called MuleSoft, you must have heard of them, have tried to explain the concept of APIs in a video that you can actually see on YouTube if you're interested. And for example, if you take the case of a travel portal, in order to book tickets, and especially if you want trying to get the best flights, usually most people wouldn't actually go to an airline and go to the airline's website and say, I want to book tickets with you. You'd go onto a travel portal or a travel website. And that in itself is something that uses an API. Because what it would do is that the interface that it uses is like your own helpful waiter. Can be asked, for example, if you went into a travel portal, it's like your waiter, and it gets asked by that online travel service to get information from the APIs of the different airlines. over the internet, and so you can book your tickets, you can get the best seats. The API also then takes the airline's airline's response, and then brings it back to you through the portal itself. And this is the same, when you think about interactions between different kinds of applications. So think of it as a waiter that's going back and forth between applications. So I try putting it there. So there's a user, and think of the API as a waiter that takes and uses methods, and the user uses methods and parameters to talk to the API, who takes your request, goes to the kitchen, brings your response back, and gives it back to you. So what's the difference? That's another point I thought someone would be interested in understanding. What's the difference between API tech writing and writing for other audiences? When I thought about it, I thought it's actually about the audience that you're writing for. You're writing for developers. In fact, you're actually writing for developers, keeping their customers in mind. For example, when an API writer creates a tutorial, we would ideally do so in a way that helps developers visualize and understand the value of an API, the value that it can add to their website or to their products, because the more value they have, the more customers they have coming in and more traffic to their websites. And a large chunk of the work that I've done in the last year, mainly on the Google Maps JavaScript API, is perhaps to try to present more value in the documentation and more value to our customers. Now, of course, there are different kinds of developers here. Front-end developers, they build websites. They translate a design into a website. But the functionality and the interactivity of a website are usually developed by a back-end developer. And they're the ones who would, back-end developers allow websites to allow users to actually do things. For example, like logging in or creating an account or connecting with friends or putting in likes there. And you usually use, to be able to do that, you usually need to know languages. And I also think it would be useful to keep in, for an API writer, it would be also useful, just like any other writer, to keep in mind the personality of developers who are reading your documentation and their different learning styles. I'll perhaps a little later in the presentation cover a bit about languages that you need to learn, if you need to learn code and things like that. The next few slides show you screenshots of the kind of developer documentation you'd see if you visited developers.google.com, and if you browsed along and then tried to look at and had a look at the documentation for the JavaScript API. So we have tutorials. I'm sorry, that's a bit unclear, isn't it? But we've created, you'd find tutorials on there. You'd see guides, how to type guides. Those are samples. So samples where we show a user that these are the different features that we have, and these are things that you can do for yourself. A lot of documentation, that's reference documentation that you could see. A lot of API documentation explains concepts. You're usually not documenting a UI, and in most cases there's no graphical user interface that you can point to, and so you'll find yourself creating a lot of conceptual documentation. Release notes, so that's something else that you'd see. So what does an API technical writer do all day? So most often you're playing around with the API to try to document it. You read if there's documentation available, you'd read any existing documentation. It really helps to talk to developers one-on-one. I find that it helps a lot because for me, I found that it actually helps because I was an individual technical writer for almost 9 years. And so I didn't have other writers to go to say, did you understand what he said? Because I didn't. But I found it really helps to say, I didn't understand a thing you said. Could you explain that to me in English? And so that really helps. But also attending engineering meetings where perhaps half the things going over your head, but you kind of have an idea of what they're trying to build. We're also very fortunate to have a great UX team, so it's really nice to hear feedback about the usability, about all the UX studies that they've done, to hear about what works for the user and what hasn't worked for the user and what we could change and make better in our documentation. And of course, while we're on the job, try to learn and update our knowledge of code and other languages. So that's a question I asked myself, do I really need to know how to code? Quite honestly, yes. But from my experience, that's something that you can learn as long as you're interested in it and you're willing to learn. You don't need to be a professional programmer to succeed at API documentation, but you do need to be able to code to some extent. Quite often, perhaps it's, and this may not be the case always, but perhaps it's not as necessary to have deep knowledge of code, but it's more wide than deep. I've also but what I found is that it's very important to understand the basic concepts. And once you've kind of learned one language, you find that in all the others, the concepts tend to blend. And I've heard, and I must admit it's true, that full immersion is the only way to really learn code and to become fluent in any language. And I guess you'll never understand what lies at the bottom if you're just trying to skim the surface. And of course, practical implementation, I guess, is the only way to really understand if you've actually understood the code. Because quite often, you might spend hours or sometimes weeks learning a certain language, and then you take a break and then come back and think, where was I and what did I learn? And you have to start right from the beginning all over again. So I really think it helps when you're able to practically implement it. So what would I say if anyone asked my opinion on whether we should invest time in learning code? Now, the only way I could compare is I'm a big fan of the ocean, but I'm also terrified by how powerful it is. And if there's anyone out there who does their ocean swimming or surfing, hats off to you. But when I think of the depth to which an API writer could go to learn how to code, I'd compare it with the sea and learning how to surf. You can either paddle on your tummy, or you could actually stand up there and ride the waves, and it's as exciting as you'd like it to be, and with the knowledge that this is constantly changing. Now, what kind of programming knowledge helps an API tech writer? Again, this is just a very, I don't think I've gone deep enough, but I thought I might just give a general overview. Languages like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript help build websites. For interactive websites, depending on how interactive you want your web application to be, you'd learn languages like Ruby or PHP, Java, Python, very popular languages. If you'd want to build apps for iPhones or iPads, the Apple TV, or release them to the App Store, you'd try to learn iOS development, and you'd use development tools like Xcode, learn languages like Objective-C or Swift. Or if you're trying to develop for the Android environment, you'd use development tools like the Android Studio, and of course a programming language called Java, which I'm quite interested in. I'm trying to get to see if I can learn in the future. Yeah, so what other skills are useful to have? And I can do all of those. I'm very well versed in all of them: hip-hop and tap dancing and Bharatanatyam and ballet, and all core skills that an API writer must have. No, I'm joking, but I wish I was any good at any of those. But jokes apart, learning coding languages, knowing your developer audience, and understanding the types of documentation are all important. But I thought I'd also highlight other resources which tremendously help if anyone's considering a transition into API writing. Someone once said that research is formalized curiosity. It's poking and prying with a purpose, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The internet has so much information out there, and if you're trying to learn a programming language, or you're trying to build an application of your own, if you're trying to use a tutorial to build an application, or you're trying to find out how to fix an issue in your application, the web offers so much open source information in the form of tutorials. You have forums like Stack Overflow, and so I just find that if you're willing to actually look for the information, you actually find a lot of information there. And quite often it's like trying to put pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. You don't get it at one go, and quite often you go back. Research helps, networking helps, and you begin to put that puzzle in piece by piece. When I applied for positions as an API tech writer, I noticed that most positions require that I produce samples of code, which I didn't have because all of my previous positions, I was mainly documenting the UI, and I didn't really have samples. With the few APIs that we had, it was usually programmers who used to create the documentation, and I just changed it for syntax or correct the language and check the layouts. And so I had to think, and then I thought, all right, I was using free programs like Code Academy, and I'm sure there are lots of others there, to kind of learn the basics of HTML and CSS, and I thought, okay, we try to create a mock web page, and with what I knew, I tried to put a map on the page, and it wasn't perfect, but it kind of worked, and which meant I had a page, but I also had my code with my HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which I could understand and I could explain, and which I think really helps to be able to put together something that you can show as samples to. And I guess it's mainly to show that you're willing to learn and that you're capable of being taught. Yeah, which brings me to another skill, and which admittedly I'm no good at, networking. And the fact that I'm here is no indication that I'm good at networking. I literally had to be dragged here. I'm a self-confessed introvert, and I cringe when I hear people talk about how important networking is. But it's true. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it's important to network and to find individuals and tech writers who have a different skill set to what you have. It also helps us be aware of the various technologies, the systems, and other products that other writers are working on. And when it comes to transitioning into API tech writing, I find that networking perhaps can help you find someone more experienced than you who can kind of guide you into the field, perhaps. Yeah, I look back at the last 12 months of my work, and I can confidently say that I could not have learned all that I have at Google if I wasn't blessed enough to have a good mentor. And for a tech writer who's stepping into an area that's more developer terrain, it helps to have someone who has the experience and skills that you don't have, and someone who's willing to teach you. And quite often the experiences they offer, their selfless offering of time, their knowledge and skills. As a person, I guess you have to be willing to be trained. You have to be willing to unlearn a lot of things that you've learned over the years. I would even suggest ask industry writers if they're willing to keep aside some time to try to mentor you. And I guess you're looking for a person who has already been in that position for an extended period of time. They have the certifications. They've done the things that you're trying to do. And it's kind of like having a safety net while you're trying to experiment with different things. And you don't feel like you're all alone when you're trying to get into a new field. And I guess overall, I thought maybe in a forum like this one, it was a good question to ask to see if we can actually try to create a mentorship program for writers who would like to be guided into the field. Because for someone who knows how good that feels and how beneficial it is, I definitely recommend that if we could actually set up such a program, it'd be really good. Yeah, and at the end, I hope you don't get all excited because if anyone has questions or thoughts, I thought I might take anticipatory bail and say I'm not an expert in API tech writing, but I'm open to questions, at least to the ones I know I can answer. Yeah, so attempted answers.
Oh, it is. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to go on a little journey here. I've broken this in two parts. Let me know which is more interesting to you. There's a part about the journey we've had as Corilla, and there's a part about what we've learned from that journey as technical writers. So we'll sort of feel that out. Feel free to heckle and shout out. It's quite interactive. Is everyone here a technical writer? Yeah? I know it seems like a dumb question, but I love seeing globally we're getting more and more developers and developer advocates coming to these events, especially Write the Docs events. And I know that Sarah's technical writing events in Mountain View sell out. I think that we have a rock star. I know we're not meant to use that word, but an actual rock star of technical writing in the room. I was not. So I will talk you through quite quickly the Corilla journey, what we learned, and just some questions at the end. I wasn't always a technical writer. This was me before my technical writer phase. I used to be a supply chain analyst, so basically I was on the developer and product side. And I ran analytics for a very large coal company's Australian operations. Then I became a technical writer. The transition was abrupt. And as you can probably see, I started to work for Red Hat. In my time at Red Hat, I joined at a very exciting time where Australia had become quite influential for the technical writing culture of the organization. We hadn't quite yet hit 2 billion revenue, we hadn't quite hit 9,000 employees worldwide, but right on the cusp. I had a lot of wild adventures when I came. They didn't believe I wanted the job. So I basically said, can you emphasize paying me in shares? That way you know you get me in 4 years, and in that 4 years I want to learn how to build product. Basically, I admitted in the interview, I don't know how open source works, and I really still don't after multiple years in it. But I had some adventures here. I got sent to Pune in India to set up Red Hat's first technical writing team over in India, and I absolutely loved it. On the other side of the screen, we can see that perhaps part of my journey at Red Hat wasn't always being in love with the tools we had. When I came back from India, I'll give you one example. I went to fix a typo in one of my docs. Clearly, I didn't put a typo in it because I would never make a mistake. But I went to fix something as simple as a typo. To do that, I had to actually update my operating system, to update a package, to update a command, to update a build chain, to update Jenkins, to build an RPM, to rsync to a server. For a bug that took someone 45 clicks to report to me. So being quite a noisy Australian and quite on the front foot, I got a reputation for sort of pulling apart the things that weren't working very well at Red Hat. But the Red Hat culture is if you find a mistake, you have to fix it. So I found a few mistakes. In my era there, basically we learned that as technical writers, we were using tools that we hated to create documentation that customers no longer read. Those two parts of that experience are what fueled my thinking that led me towards founding Corilla. We could see here that number one thing was the tools are complicated. That example I gave you of having to update an operating system, Fedora, to actually fix a typo in our build chain is just insane. Likewise, collaboration, we just couldn't collaborate. Other tools we saw on the market when we tried to buy tools from Adobe, Madcap, and the others, they make great products, but for us at the time, they were very expensive, hard to trial, really difficult to deploy. So we built something called the PressGang CCMS. There are a lot of in-jokes as we built this because the very first version was a box that we hid under our desk. And we got caught making our own content management system because we quite accidentally made a good one, meaning that our job that would normally take 5 days a week started to take us 2 days a week. So in that time, I managed to become Red Hat's first startup advocate because I had literally 3 days a week of my job that I could go and do other things. Kind of like Google time, except we get in trouble for it. So what we see here is your classic write on the left, render on the right, DocBook XML publishing system. It's very, very, very ugly, but the first version of this actually was a lot more ugly than this. This is the best we could come up with. This is the absolute best product inside Red Hat I could come up with. That journey was pretty cool. We took over 2/3 of Red Hat's global software documentation. We're responsible for 800 plus books. Mine were converted into 24 plus languages, which is always quite a barrel of laughs if you've ever had to field a conversation with a translator. You learn a lot about how bad your writing is very quickly. Out of that journey, however, we got a bit of notoriety in the company, and we got enabled enough, so we basically won every award inside of Red Hat as a team, not me individually. And we kind of created this idea that we were an internal startup. It's mostly true, right? So a group of us came and made something we felt really strongly about, and over time we started to read startup books and started to speak at technical writing events about how we built this thing, which is a whole different other journey. And one day someone came up to me at an event. Does anyone recognize the guy? Does anyone recognize the successful guy? Right. So this is Bob Young, the co-founder of Red Hat and the first CEO of the company. We actually got chatting on Twitter one day, and how we actually met and the birth of Corilla in a very real and embarrassing sense was I saw an article about something he did for his family on Twitter, and I retweeted it. And as I like to do, I added his name. Bob replied, "Hey, I'm speaking in New Zealand at a Linux conference soon. If you're in the neighborhood, you should come." I had no plans of going, but being me, I was like, "Oh yeah, I've already got my tickets. It's going to be amazing." And I was buying my tickets as I replied. Then I said, "By the way, we've done this thing in your old company, and I think it's interesting as a first-time startup founder inside the company, maybe we can have a chat about your experiences building what you've built." He replied 5 minutes later, "Cool, why don't we talk on stage together?" And I started to ping everyone I knew at LinuxConf, "Please let me speak, please let me speak, please let me speak." In the end, I basically flew myself over. It was the first event I ever spoke as Corilla, not as Red Hat's PressGang CCMS. One of those names is easier to say than the other. After about half an hour with Bob, he just laughed at me and he said, "How many years have you been talking about PressGang?" I said, "About 2, 3 years. How many countries?" "Probably about 10 plus, lost track." "How many people are using it?" "Oh, about, 20, 30 people." He's like, "No, companies, no, people." Friends, family, basically me with lots of user accounts. And he said, what are they telling you every time that you're trying to say, install this open source server software? I'm saying, well, they're telling me that it's much easier if it was just something like, I don't know, like a Confluence, when you can pull your credit card out. And he started laughing and said, "You're the worst startup CEO I've ever met in my entire life, because the customers are saying, we want to pay you this much money a month to use this and not have to install it." He said, but having said that, he wrote me a check and he became our first angel investor and asked us to spin out of Red Hat. We didn't know where to go next, so like any good collection of startup founders in Brisbane, Australia, we went to Numa in Paris, where we became the first international startup accepted to their startup accelerator. I still don't know why we went, to be honest, but it was great to be exotic. It was a fantastic course, and everyone, when you say Paris, they do a thing. When I say Paris, I say Paris, but some people say, what was it like at Paris? City of light and city of love. There's always something in the sky, city of light, city of love. Well, this is a photo I took, to be fair, of Paris, but my reality was something a little bit more like this. 6 months of my life stuck in front of probably the ugliest Kanban boards and whiteboards. I have a little red hat up on the thing to show that I'm still representing. Actually I remember this one. This was our first alpha build before we went to write the docs, the shirt I'm wearing today. But what we managed to do in that time, so our first investors were Bob. He wrote us a small amount. Google for Entrepreneurs came on board and a couple of private investors. And we tackled, basically our whole time there was looking at the problem. And there's a couple of people in this crowd that I chatted to before I went over. Like Sarah was kind enough to meet me in Sydney. My number one thing was, what's wrong with these tools? Am I the only person that's unhappy? What is the solution that we can build over a couple of years' time? So for us, we really wanted to build something that had easy to use version control. Because version control is not easy to use. I love docs as code. How many people use Git? How many people love Git? How many people are lying? Right? Okay, so as technical writers, at no point in your education training, when you were learning to read and write, there's no point someone said, by the way, you're going to learn to code. You're going to have to learn Git. You're going to have to learn command lines. But we take that as granted now. So that's something that I started to think about. We also want to do something with free trials. We wanted to really emphasize collaboration because I started to see a trend, we'll touch on later in this, about it's not just the technical writers writing. There's more people involved in that. And it's getting more important to talk to those people at scale. So that's great. It's a photo of me with my eyes closed. But so we had this beautiful, large moment where at the end of the Startup Accelerator, you're on a giant stage and there's hundreds of, well, I want to say thousands, billions of investors in the crowd and media, and there's so much pressure on you to show what you've built. All we'd actually done in our Startup Accelerator was work out everything we did wrong at Red Hat in building the first tool we won, which, remember, was a tool that won every internal award at Red Hat. So we had this cognitive dissonance. We didn't really understand the thing we built and the thing that had happened in the market had changed so quickly in the last couple of years. And I'm sure we can all agree that the last few years of technical writing have changed faster than any other since the point where we put cave paintings, our hands on the wall. And I really believe that we are now at the most important time of human narrative and ways to communicate difficult concepts to each other. I had a flight to go to an event and sort of try to understand this dissonance between the thing we built and the thing we're trying to build. And we started to worry a little bit about money, started to worry about what would be like if we launched and people didn't like it. And I read a book by the founders of Basecamp, and they basically said, I love this. I took a photo of this on the plane. As soon as we landed, I told the team, whatever code we have right now that works, ship it. That's the alpha. Ship it. And it was awful. And it was really awful. But somehow, we got a couple of customers that first night saying, we understand what you're trying to do and what your story is, and they're the first people to give us $25 a month for this utterly awful piece of software that I only shipped because I read a book on my Kindle. I sent this photo to the customer and said, you're using a piece of product because I own a Kindle and this book happened to be on there, so thank you. But what we managed to build was Corilla. So what is it? It's a publishing tool for technical writers. It's all about collaboration and an emphasis on intuitive user flows. We didn't come up with this. I love that customers tell us what our product is better than we can ever imagine. The number one rule of technical writers, I think now, is not listening to devs. Sorry, devs. It's actually listening to your users, listening to your customers. We live and breathe that, and a customer one day said, this is amazing. This is actually like GitHub for content teams, and that makes me smile. I'll move into sort of what we've learned, but a couple of nice trophy moments for us was, so when we went across to France, while we were there, we raised 100K, so Google for Entrepreneurs were great. Hippo Ventures, that's Bob Young's Red Hat money, basically, Numa. We're really excited in the beta round. We hit 1,000 teams. We use a product called Intercom to see where they are, and it's really cool to see how many countries around the world they are. Kind of helps you think about, as documentarians, we're doing this. I wish we could see this as documentarians, how many people are reading our docs and where they're from. But as a product developer now, I love seeing these different countries come online as people start using this. We raised another 250K recently from Hippo Ventures, and then something really, really scary happened as a startup. We actually hit break even. It's scary because we have reporting tools to show how much money we're spending each month, and they broke for 2 months in a row, and I was starting to get stressed until someone pointed out it wasn't that we'd run out of red, is that we're now in the black, and I hadn't actually coded to show that we were in a profit. So we built our reporting tools to show that how much money we're losing until we're dead, but we're the opposite of dead. So that's another little tip for anyone out there wanting to work with startups. And something sneaky I've crept on there is we don't like talking about launches, but we've just GA'd 2 hours ago. If the build chain's complete, I thought it'd be fun just to push a new version out. So people that are signing up at the moment are getting the new version of Corilla, and we're going to flip the website probably tonight, unless I have a couple of drinks and the team around the world do. And we're just kind of constantly soft launching with weekly builds. So the more interesting stuff, rather than our misadventures to go from literally a bunch of angry idiots sitting in an office in Brisbane, which is what we were at the time, to a bunch of happy idiots now, is what we learned in the process. Feel free to disagree. It'd be really fun to kind of argue some of these points if you really disagree. But I have the microphone, so I'm louder. So collaboration needs to put emphasis, someone can edit that for me, please. Collaboration needs to put emphasis on UX over features. Something really awesome happened when Atlassian announced the acquisition of Trello, which we've been watching for a while because we're very close with both companies. It validated exactly what we're doing. So what Corilla's always been for me is Red Hat is an amazing company of very technical people. Amazingly technical people, so much so that you have to be as technical as them to get their respect. And the more technical we get, sometimes we forget that users don't have to be as smart as we do. They just need to do the thing they need to do. Do the damn thing they need to do, right? Like often it's a server is on fire and they're sitting in a room with noisy servers and they just want to get it up and running. Why should they need to know how to compile a kernel to do that? I obsessed about this so much at Red Hat, I sort of created a bit of a UX movement in various areas, obsessing over like people with MacBooks and fancy glasses and using Heroku rather than our open source products. And I think this has panned out over time. So Trello obviously is a competitor of Jira in many senses. But Jira has 1 million more features, so why are people using Trello? This is an argument I've grown up in open source. People say, of course you're going to use open source. It's got way more features. Well, basically, Corilla is to Confluence what Trello is to Jira. And we notice we have a huge uptick recently of people leaving Confluence. I often joke, especially if Mike's in the crowd, I often joke that Confluence is where good content goes to die. Because it's not a CMS. If you can tell me what the M in CMS is in any of these products on the market, I'll give you one of Campaign Monitor's free coconut waters. Because it just doesn't exist. So we're building machine learning into the tool. It's something further down the line because this M doesn't exist and this emphasis on UX doesn't exist. So that's been nice. The middle one gets me into trouble in the US quite a lot. So we're based in quite a few countries at the moment. So we have team in 5 countries, customer in 80, and I travel around a fair bit where the customer base is. I often say technical writing is now content marketing. I'm pausing to say that. Does anyone disagree? Does it offend anyone? That's okay. Good. I'm glad you find it offensive because I did too. Because my team wrote a suite of documentation for Red Hat that's responsible for 1/3 of the company's $2 billion revenue globally. So we thought we were kind of important, except we wrote giant books. And in my early pitches, I used to actually go to investor pitches with a giant book and say, are there any technical writers in the room? A few people put their hand up. And I'd throw the book on the table and go, boom. The louder that sound, the happier the product teams were, because they're like, that's so much documentation, we've documented the hell out of the product. Guess what happens? No one reads that book. Guess what they do? They go to Stack Overflow, or they go to Google. Every page is page 1, and it's, I'm not sure who in our community coined that term, but it's so true. So I had to face the facts that me being UX, IA, whatever fancy term I want to give myself, was missing the fact we weren't tracking the analytics of our users. We were writing books because we were Red Hat. We're the world's best open source people, hands down. except we didn't understand that no one was reading our documentation anymore. So when I've written hundreds and hundreds of pages of very technical documentation, and my silly test on Stack Overflow, writing and answering my own questions, is where all the people are going instead, I realized 2 days' work for the company is a lot cheaper than 6 months. But I'm happy to note it out. Mm. And again, it's okay. Kind of is sometimes, really. No, kind of is sometimes. If we think about, mm, not so much. Yeah. Well, mm, mm, mm. I, I want to encourage you to keep that rage, though, because something really awesome is happening. It doesn't matter what you and I think. Factually, this is happening, whether you like it or not, right? Whether we like it or not, as content experts and technical writers, we are merging with that industry, if only because that's what the CEO is writing the budget for. And these teams are merging. It's happening. You can't escape it. So the STC can believe this isn't happening, but what we can do as write the docs is to actually look at real patterns around the world. And as someone that spends a lot of time on planes meeting these people, I had the same response. I was like, this is snake oil. But then when I actually realized my rage was calling them to account for using their techniques better, and by bringing the kind of slightly lofty expertise we have sometimes, it's merging them to become a really awesome thing where you can sit down and have a content strategist say, hey, I know how Google AdWords work. I was about to say Facebook ads, but we have 2 Google people here. And wonderful Google AdWords. We won't necessarily use it, but we could do a test. When we release a product, could we advertise some of our quick start guides? Would that be interesting? Or could we look at ways that SEO works? And I hate the term SEO. I don't like SEO. But I have to face it as a reality, because if I'm writing 200 pages of documentation and each one of those pages is getting indexed, wouldn't it be nice to understand how they're getting indexed? Yeah. But again, look, this is awesome. I'm not trolling, right? It's something that, like it or not, those departments are merging. They are. Those roles are merging. The skills are merging. There's a very tricky conversation about demographics too, about university graduates coming in as technical writers. They're being exposed to these different forms of content strategy as well. And I like that there's that rage there, because I think we'll get better and better content if we embrace. Plus, I'm a bit of a hippie. I want everyone to get along. And if the teams are merging these people, it'd be nice if they understand what each other do. So we're okay with that. No one's fist fighting. We're all still good. Is my NPS going up and down a little bit? I saw my chart. That's my chart up there, is it? Okay. Okay. So slide 2. So basically, something really interesting happened here. When we made this product, we were a management product. We were a place to author content and to handle extremely large volumes of markdown files. And we have a very clever way, of putting those files together and making dynamic content. So we made a HTML portal just for fun, to show people what you could do with it. That's what people started paying for. And when I started to sit with the customers, and it's a classic startup thing, you're not building the thing you think you're building. You're building what the people are buying. We found out that by bundling the CMS and the docs portal and the analytics tools and the editorial tools and the team management tools and the collaboration tools that we built into Corilla, that's actually what's saving people two areas. Where we make most of our cost savings for companies is that it used to be $20 a call for customer support. I don't know why we don't talk about this as technical writers. We are actually saving people scalable money every time they release a product. If we write a good document, and we are on somewhere between 60 to $150K a year for most technical writing roles, that is pretty expensive for some companies, but if we can show the value of that against reducing customer support, that's how you get more budgets in technical writing teams. That's how we get sales. But something really cool happened. We had a lot of people in our early version saying we could build what you've done. And I'd sit down with them and say, yeah, you can. And I'd sit with the CEO and the teams. Who's used Jekyll? Who's put together, like most of us, right? Most of us have put together build chains like that. But when I'd say, what do you cost the company? How long does it take you to maintain it? It was really interesting to see that companies like us, or ignore us, readme.io, Greg's company is fantastic. We should all know Eric Holscher from Read the Docs, the Write the Docs founder. Companies like this are actually doing an amazing job for like 20 to 50 bucks a month, doing something that costs the company thousands of dollars a month to create their own Jekyll build chains. It's really fascinating to see these startups emerge. I'll move through these other ones quite quickly. Eric wrote an amazing post about how Markdown should never be used for documentation. A few heads nodding. It was awesome. We get on really well. He pinged it to me laughing. He said, sorry, dude, I know you've chosen Markdown for the first version of Corilla, but I really believe this. Do you want to have any comment? And I said, no, I'm going to read all the Hacker News comments, cry myself to sleep, and then I'll talk to you tomorrow, which is exactly what happened. But something really, really funny happened. Hacker News basically melted with rage that Markdown even exists on the planet, because how dare this format exist? And everything Eric wrote is true. But then we had some of the biggest upswell of signups we've ever had in our product's life. The more the elitists hated on this thing, the more the general population was like, wait, that's not Word. Hang on, what? Not DocBook XML? I don't have to use 300 elements hand-coded and go through a validation chain that fails 10 times. I can just use this Corilla thing for 25 bucks a month. It was absolutely insane. So I sent Eric so many emojis, love heart and hug emojis those few days. But then something else happened. So we realized that Markdown is serious. It is real. It's a temporary format for us. Corilla is an anything format. We're building on top of Pandoc and our own custom extensions that you can run in any format. I don't care, and I don't want to be around people that even care about formats. Like, why are we arguing about DocBook XML versus ASCII doc versus REST? Like, that's a scientific problem. We can solve that. So I was surprised to see how much serious documentation is coming. But another former Red Hatter created something called ASCII Doctor and is maintaining it. Dan's a fabulous guy. And Dan was always trying to get us to use ASCII Doc instead of Markdown. We're just implementing it now. The problem that we've seen and that we heard from users is, who here wrote Markdown before they used GitHub? Anyone? That's actually impressive. You guys are elite. And it ruins my point. So can you both leave for a minute and I'll redo that? Okay, so my premise, 80% of the time, is that most of us learned Markdown because it was in a popular product. It was a format that was just simply very usable in a really well-designed product. So the challenge for those of us making these tools, trying to get people to use ASCII doc instead of Markdown, is to make a good product that proves it works. So I'm hoping that a few more companies, I don't see them as competitors, a few more peers come up in our space, and we all move to ASCII doc to get people more powerful. But it's really fascinating to talk to customers and hear them say, like, they read Eric's post, they realize Markdown there, they want to pay money to use the tool, and then they're waiting for us to give them something better. So again, it's kind of like an empathy in service design to remember our users don't care what religion we have as technical writers, they just want to slowly get better every year. Speaking of religion, Docs is code. I prescribe to this one. But something we worked out quite quickly is that Docs is code, as in getting technical writers to use Git, putting them in GitHub. I think that's fascinating, but there's one massive flaw. One of our sales pitches is I joke about, has anyone ever seen that thing where you try to find a file or you listen to marketing people and like, hey, where's that file for the press release? Is it under G Drive, the one that's like final release, final -7 -9, or is it one that's final, use this one, not the other one, draft? Like, that's something as devs that we've solved with version control. But it occurs to me how ridiculous it is to use version control and then force ourselves to go through multiple repos for reusable content and to be cherry picking and doing these things. One of our biggest UX missions and UI challenges at Corilla is that you don't see the repo. There's one repo. It's an invisible repo. You just have search because we know metadata and tags and other elements are far more discoverable. So even though I love Docs as code, and everyone buy Anne Gentle's new book, which came out yesterday on this topic, I should get kickbacks on that, I hope. I really think that there's a major flaw in the Docs as code is it's just replicating the inefficiency of the file system in repos. And the last couple of ones are obviously DX, the developer, the fact that I can say DX, and most people kind of nod along now, shows that holy war is gaining traction, and it's really awesome. And it's because of these wonderful API writers, I think, and the power of APIs that people are carrying what developers think, which is great as a developer, finally, some empathy. But it's actually driving up investment in documentation, which is super cool. I guarantee if we teleport ourselves to an STC meetup, it's doom and gloom. Before the ASTC members, the ATW mailing list, there's a Yahoo-based mailing list that is just nothing but constant gloom that technical writing is dying. And yet, those of us on the other side who are interfacing with the devs are seeing devs are actually telling the managers to spend money on these tool chains and to get people collaborating more. It's like, again, it's the best time to be a technical writer since people put their hands on the wall with paint, which is like the first kind of technical writing of how to do things like stick spears into cows and eat them. Respect to any vegetarians in the crowd, sorry. Code of conduct and all that. And the final point we learned is, yeah, Doxa didn't happen. I really love this. I don't know who first coined it. In fact, I just printed up a bunch of stickers if anyone wants some Doxa didn't happen stickers, because I find that quite amusing. The sticker pack that came in from Sticker Mule 3 days ago in my office was about this big, and I left it sort of on my desk near the front of the office. And we had a tour of visiting developers from South America. And there's so many devs that laugh at the whole Doxa didn't happen thing that I had to reorder the stickers again. So it's not just our industry that thinks that's an interesting point. And the final thing I learned, building software for enterprises is really, really difficult. And we can only have done this literally because of the community. Whether that's in the early days sleeping on couches, people like Eric and the Right Docs community really pushing users for us. And the last images I'll leave you with is there's a kind of naivety when you build these tools as technical writers for technical writers, and because it does take 2 to 5 years. I mean, look, we're standing here in a 10, 12-year-old company. I guess the first 5 years weren't exactly 201 Elizabeth Street, Sydney. So when we left Red Hat and when we took our first funding, it felt like we were building a rocket ship. And if you had spoke to me, so first time Sarah and I spoke in the Google office, I would have just been bouncing off the walls, all that free Google coffee, but also just like enthusing about this opportunity to build the world's best software, right? So when we released the thing we released, I'm talking rocket ship, rocket ship, rocket ship, and what we throw out of our hand is a paper plane. And it's only the faith of the community that says that paper plane is the best rocket ship I've ever seen. So thank you for everyone that supported us to this point.